Pronto? Funziona? Bene.
Can you hear me? Well, very good. We can start. Welcome. So, rights, duties, truth. The power of the powerless. This is the title of this session. We are going to talk about it with Francesco Occhetta, journalist and writer for La Civiltà Cattolica. And he also deals with training and political education schools. Well, he wrote many books. His last one is entitled Ricostruiamo la politica, Let's Build Politics Again. And that tells a lot about the current political scenario in our country. And the book aims also at outlining some guidelines about our reality. And then we have Pavel Fischer. We have a senator from the Czech Republic. He lives in Prague. He's the chairperson of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate of the Czech Republic. He was ambassador in Paris for his country for 7 years. And before that, and this is the reason why we came across him and met him, and that's why he's here, he was also the head of the political secretary of Václav Havel, so the historic president of the Czech Republic. So he's somehow Václav Havel, so the sort of main character, so to speak, of this meeting, even if he is not here. So we're going to tackle this issue. So, rights, duties, and truths. And certainly, Václav Havel would have to tell a lot about these three topics. And he made the duty of truth as his reason of life. He was born in 1936, and he lived the vast majority of his life under the communist regime. He was an author, a playwright. He was very multifaceted, and because of history, he had to become a dissident and to protect civil rights. He went through, in 1968, the Spring of Prague and also the invasion of Soviet panzers. And then he became, in 1977, the paper spokesperson in 1977. And first a group, the so-called Carta 77, and so that became a movement to protect people that had been put in prison without no reason. I think that he was also incarcerated for 6 years, and in October 1989, 2 months before becoming president of the Czech Republic, he was arrested. And that was somehow the climax of development revolution that brought to landmark change. And in 1989, in December, he becomes the first non-communist president since 1948. And then he leads his country to the EU, to NATO, and he also leads to the end of the Warsaw Pact. So certainly he played a key role in the transition to a free world of his country. So certainly he would have had to say a lot. And we tried to somehow to tell what he would have said about these three topics in the exhibition, The Power of the Powerless. And we have somehow imagined a set of questions that could be the perfect questions to all the answers he gave in his books. So I hope that you will visit the exhibition, and you will certainly come across a great character, a great person from any point of view, human, cultural, and political. But why are we here today to still talk about this topic 40 years after? Because the first publication in Italy was 40 years ago. And first of all, because this is still an up-to-date topic, and also because his thoughts would perfectly fit into today's Italy and today's European Union, for also what he did and said and thought all through his life. Havel will also be present in our meeting, thanks to the words of Father Occhetta, who is going to sort of react to his testimony. And please read the article published on Sussidiario today that is devoted to Havel. And then we have Pavel Fischer, who met him personally, and he could share with him the most meaningful years of his human and political adventures. So, rights, duties, truth. For Havel, the very first right of any man is to be himself or herself. So, especially, well, he was not a Catholic, but he said, where the Lord put you to live. And being oneself is also a duty, so not giving up one's own dignity, not giving up one's own responsibility that come from that status. So you have the responsibility to experience the world, so you cannot and you should not delegate to fashion, to ideology, to political power our own reason. So man should not sort of somehow hide or reduce the secret intentions of life. And this is the power of the powerless. So the possibility to experience the truth, the relation to the self. It's about our connection to the absolute and the experience of what is absolute. That is what is inside any experience, according to Havel's words. So any kind of power is afraid of this voice of the self that cannot be silenced ever, because it is deeply rooted in any man, even powerful men. So all the words I've just mentioned are Havel's words. But now, well, we will give the floor to our guests. I would like to start from Padre Occhetta. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me here. I would like to thank Mrs. Guarnieri and Mr. Vittadini, and then Francesco Magni, Ubaldo Casotto for the beautiful exhibition that they made about Havel, and also the voluntary workers and Senator Fischer. So I decided to pay homage to Havel's memory because in order to use an expression that we Jesuits love very much, it was like a fire that lightened up other fires. And his testimony burnt political lies, and somehow he was able to merge truth, to melt, gold, and only fire can do that. So he was born in 1936. He was forced to 2 years of some specific jobs. And in April 1965, he published a letter expressing criticism. And then in 1976, he establishes Carta 77 that was designed to reaffirm the importance of having the freedom of speech. And then there was a time of prison, and then the time of politics. So he went through so many steps, and I was always struck by the fact that he never, ever lost his freedom during all these cycles. So I'll give you 3 words. So we have duties and rights that are 2 facets of the same coin. It depends on the definition of freedom. You can have a freedom from that leads to liberalism and subjectivism, and also totalitarianisms. And then you can also have a freedom that is created for the others, that leads to popularism and communitarianism. Moreover, we can also consider duties and rights under government forms that are in opposition to totalitarianism and to totalitarian regimes. But should we emphasize the rules or the principles? Well, when it comes to rules, the government forms that just rely on rules, they can also lead to characters like Mussolini and Hitler, but only if you delve more into the principles, if you develop that, because the principles get us together through the social relations. This is something that the market cannot sell or manipulate. So Havel just focused on this aspect, and he lived all his life like that. We are in 89, and in his first New Year's speech, Havel, and this is the very first word I want to mention, he reminds the people of the duty of memory. So the duty of remembering and of remembrance. Maybe some of you wrote petitions to set him free. So as a people of CL, you certainly were very close to him. Maybe the youngest one do not know, not any longer, who he was and who he has been. It's a bit like the same as it is with Aldo Moro. There was a study according to which only 30% of our youngsters know who Moro was. So memory, remembering. So how can we transmit and pass on our memory? Because otherwise everything we forget, Primo Levi said, could come back. So the duty of remembrance and of memory is extremely important. That's why Don Giussani strongly wanted to consider this book, The Power of the Powerless, as a key element to rebuild the social fabric starting from a testimony. So first of all, the power is to remember what is the difference between what is human and what can suffocate what is human, like totalitarian regimes. According to Havel, they are the expropriation of man and his consciousness, of his reason, and of his natural language. They make it close to a machine, and they classify him in producers, consumers, sick person, tourist, immigrant, and so on and so forth. So what does this mean for a person who is a believer when the second commandment is emptied of meaning? Because if my neighbor dies, what happens? My neighbor disappears. And so maybe I can be scared by the other. So it becomes a danger. And so I cannot reorganize the needs of my neighbor, my other, because politics is just about reorganizing constantly needs in society. So what does Havel tell us? That we need to comply with the duty of memory and bring back and remember what is worth of knowing and experiencing, and trying to distinguish good from evil and human from inhuman. That's why he defines politics as the art of the impossible. He used to say that certainly, well, politics seems to be about compromises, contracts. This is the art of the possible, but he asked for more. The art of the impossible, that should put at the very heart the human element. That's why somehow he overturned the traditional political schemes. First of all, the person and then society. And a person can join society and remain a person. This is, what is possible through the associations, the so-called intermediate bodies. So we have social bodies, we have families, we have NGOs, we have trade unions, we have political parties. These are the entities that let us meet each other and also forgive each other, because life is possible only if we reduce at the maximum the possible social frictions. And then the constitutional somehow organization that should be designed to be at the service of people and to be at the service of the subsidiarity principle. And this is exactly, for instance, what the Subsidiarity Foundation is trying to do. He could have escaped. He was very well known. He was very educated. He could have gone to Paris, London, or Rome. Instead, he stayed with his people. He remained there in his land. He went to prison. This is a great testimony. And the consistency of life was fully witnessed by him and his deeds. There's a second key word that is a second power of the powerless, and is the moderation, because Havel was a moderate person, And that's why he was able to inspire the development revolution of '89, and that overturned communism in Czechoslovakia. So, and then in '91, the Warsaw Pact was somehow sort of cancelled, and even Gorbachev, was taken by surprise, so to speak, and moderation, and that let him sort of enter the NATO pact that would have guaranteed more peace to Europe, and especially to Eastern Europe. And so he was right even about this. As a moderate and mild man, so he had he knew about the possible comeback of nationalism, and we know what happened later on. Even Mitterrand, in his last speech in Strasbourg in '95, reminded to what extent Havel talked about the danger of nationalism in terms of war. So his moderate and mild attitude made it sort of overturn totalitarianism. And then after that, we have a market where anything has a price tag, but that led to a sort of distortion of reality, relying on fears. So that also made it possible to have a pure matrix, an Hegelian matrix that goes beyond all that. So we are more inclined to believe in pure spirit, in ideas, than into concrete facts. Why? Because we are scared. So what do we get from that? That leads to the idea of the nostalgia of an epic history, of the pureness of blood, of a perfect government, of strong leaders to whom we want to entrust all of our freedom. But this is the new ideology. If Pavel was here with us, he would say this is the new ideology. It's a new form of post-totalitarianism, post-totalitarian regime. If you read Havel's words, is very clear on the solutions: less state, more cooperation, solidary market, human work, and the management of common themes in Europe. So the man-machine relation, the management of our data, so our privacy and environmental topics, and the Christian roots of Europe. This is what Pope Francis in his Laudato Si calls a new integral human development model. So we are not here to emphasize a little small party to be reconstructed or not at all. If you want to give an alternative to public space, we can do it only together by laying the foundations of this new integral human development. And Havel had already foreseen all that. That's why Havel says, and here we have another interesting point, the creation of a new political and economic model can be done and designed only as an expression of a changing life. So before reforming structures that need to be reformed, because this second part of the Constitution should be reformed for us, and the very first priority for Havel is to reform those who are going to reform the structures over history, so according to a certain historic dynamics. I had the chance to meet Havel only through his words, and also my Jesuit brothers from his country. And while he was in prison, they used to somehow live the experience of catechism in a sort of underground way. It was secret because the pressure of the totalitarian regime had somehow emptied the hearts of the people. And so Havel was seen and considered as a witness of freedom. And so it was giving back dignity to the whole country. A third power of the powerless is very simple, according to his words, is the force and strength of words. So the synthesis of of the real power. So, but what about the regimes that you're and the governments that we're experiencing today? Do they have a strategy? Well, they try to empty the words that set us free, the words that we utter on the world and to the world, because we shape the world through our words. So they try to reduce our freedom there. Havel never sort of silenced his voice, never ever, not even in prison. He shared it with as a playwright and as a politician. It tells us that we have to take care of the words because our words unveil what we are. And when we communicate who we are, what we are, even if we do not want. And considering that today there's a trace that is left of anything on the network, on the internet, we need to know that, for instance, when people are recruited by a company, there are a specific big data gatherer that somehow can define and set up and trace back our CV through our words. So what are we facing today? What are we confronted with? We're going through all the languages and speeches of all the populist leaders that use identity religion, for instance, to exclude other people. And also as Caesar in the Roman Empire used the holy element when he used to say, I owe God my greatness. And they seem to make people believe that the medium, the object, is more than enough to express the meaning of life. Instead, human dignity is acknowledged only through the words that you exchange between and among men and women. So words of opinion, of dialogue, of alliance, of mediation, of representation. These words then become laws and rules. That's why, to Havel, the word democratic is the real alternative to violence. So democratic word is the real alternative to violence. We should pay extra attention in the public space because I can debunk an idea but not destroy the other person, because otherwise we sort of end up in the principle of any war. And all that starts from the use we make of words. There is a condition to Havel, and I'm about to end my speech. That is the following. We need to overcome lies because this is something that any man can start doing, as Pavel would say. And he says the denial of absolute and the postulate of modernity. And he says the moral order is superior to the political, economic, and legislative order. And that's why in his book he talks about a grocery seller, and he's the greatest dissident of all. He's not named because it takes away from the window of his shop of the regime saying, workers from all over the world, get together. Because this is the first act that somehow triggers the lie. Because if you question reality, if you question the reality you're experiencing, is the start of any form of freedom. Otherwise, lies that are a creation of the mind will let you remain a slave forever. That's why you decide to become a dissident, because you ask questions, you question yourself. So for Havel, everything starts from that, from a snowball that can lead to an avalanche, he says. We cannot calculate what a fact of ours can change or trigger in history. Well, but we do not believe in that. Havel writes, under the mild surface of lies lives the real secret world of the secret intentions of life, its secret openness to truth. Living in lies is something typical. Even those who accept passively what happens live in lies. And there are some parallelism with Hannah Arendt, and I wrote a part of my book on that. In her book on the origins of totalitarianism, she writes, it's not a persuaded or communist, the ideal subject of a totalitarian regime, but instead the individual for whom the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, true or false, does not exist any longer. And according to a study by Infosphere in Italy, 80% of Italians are not able any longer to sort of recognize real news from fake news. Why? Because we're trapped in lies, and then we reshare the lies, And this is exactly what Havel says when we sort of somehow try to avoid the responsibility we have. And I would like to talk about the Jesuit approach to truth. And our General Father yesterday, Father Sousa, explained that very, very well. In 1523, Ignacio di Loyola says that naming the lie that inhabits us is the beginning of our freedom. What does evil do when we follow it? It uses us, it abuses us, amuses us, and then we get accused by it. So usually when it comes to evil, there is a sort of evolution from pleasure to enjoyment, but then we feel sort of regret. But think about corruption, organized crime, unfaithfulness, the inability to somehow self-manage and self-organize ourselves. So all that, according to Havel, means living in lies. And those dynamics are like a drug. To be effective, you need a big dose. So what do? We tend to use words that work like sort of addictive substances and drugs that need to be more and more powerful. Instead, being good is something that requires us to work hard, but once you do it, you get everything that you cannot buy on a market, and those are the effect of constructing the good. So it's the trust and confidence by the others, interior peace, serenity, and understanding love. Then there is the last word. Havel asks us to look for the soul of things, and on Europe, he says that we should try to look for the soul of Europe. Well, don't you find this principle as extremely up to date? When the Berlin Wall collapsed, there were two possible choices for Havel. The first one was to regret the old regime and try to reproduce old solutions, or trying to dare to dream and imagine something new. If we're here today, we are here to imagine the new altogether. And so each one should ask themselves, well, in my small life, what kind of brick can I bring to build up a public space, so the common good? Which is my level of responsibility as an individual? Well, and that's where my truth stems from. He chose the latter, so he decided to dare to dream. And the best way to resist totalitarian regimes is to somehow get rid of it and set our soul free from it. And for a believer, it's something very important, because that means that we are possessed by an element that gives us the force to turn power into service. Havel was not Catholic, but thanks to his words and thoughts, we can create a bridge and talk even to a person who want to separate people into believers and non-believers, but simply in between ethical and non-ethical people. Just that, ethical and non-ethical people. This is the only condition to serve truth. So I would like to conclude with these questions. So what is the heritage of Havel? What it tells us to do? First of all, do not choose nihilism, and let us be guided by nihilism, because this sort of carefree attitude will lead to totalitarianism. Which are the antidotes suggested by Havel? First of all, try to deeply live a dialogue, a constant dialogue with one's own consciousness. Secondly, trying to go back to deep spiritual experiences. And thirdly, this is my sort of suggestion, being able to experience silence and to rebuild parallel somehow cities and polis, small communities, small thinking communities that were able to do great things. Think about Camaldoli in 45, but well, there are so many examples in Europe. We know our own in Italy, and then the Gasperi in the 50s and 60s. So anything that can be related to populism and populism can be fought against with popularism, mediation spirit, so more Europe, ability to build up communities, interclassism, because the European populism so attacks minorities, and the leaders are considered as fathers and masters, unique voices in the media. So sovereignism is somehow sort of enhanced, and we ignore the social intermediate bodies, and populists do not want at all to talk with other interlocutors representing citizens. Think about what that does mean for entities like CL and the church, and then the public opinion is formed through simply urges to emotions and emotional attitude. Havel also reminds us of the important dialogue with what is impermanent and what is transcendent. What we do will remain there forever, the good deeds that we do. So to him, there is something on the other side. That's why do I care so much for the final judgment? Well, I do care because all through my life I thought that everything that happens cannot be cancelled, so remains there forever. Havel says that any being has a memory. So what does this mean to us? The political life for the gospel, Luke 10 means to be moved by compassion. Havel taught us this, and this is common to all men of goodwill. A Samaritan that, sees a person in need, decides to help that person. To him, the other is still alive. And if the other dies in the culture, is a danger. But there's more than that. Ethical people, the people who have dressed, fed, welcomed, and visited people in prison. In the final judgment, Matthew 25, surprise, asked the Lord, but when did we do all that? And the answer is, each time that you have done those things to just one of my smaller brothers, you did it to me. And this is exactly what we should do to pay homage to Havel memory. Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, Father Occhetta. And now I'm really eager to listen to our friend Fischer's words. And he is not the only one here who met Havel. Some of us met him in the 80s, well, secretly, of course, when people used to go to Prague. But certainly you knew him quite well.
Sono onorato a Rimini. Sono persuado.
I'm honored to be here to talk in Rimini, and I'm convinced that Havel can be a source of inspiration even today. I do not speak.
Sorry, thank you very much for an invitation today. Today is the 21st of August. In 1968, the hopes of freedom were destroyed by armed vehicles which came into our country from abroad and stopped what was named Prague Spring. Started a very difficult period which was called later normalization. In this period of normalization, it was very difficult to speak out, to write, to create, to take part in the political life, or to be engaged in the society if you were not under the umbrella of the Communist Party. And in these times, Václav Havel becomes important because he escaped the fear and he escaped the trap of lying of this regime that we could call totalitarian. What is a totalitarian regime about? No rights are granted. Civic or individual rights are put aside. There is disrespect for freedom, and there is denial of freedom, but we can go even further. There is a very pernicious attempt to spiritual life of each individual. Because totalitarian regime struggles to disintegrate the soul or to break apart soul of human beings. By the oppression made to people and to each individual, we become obliged to lie, to dissimulate, to play the game. I remember when I was 6 years old and I first time came to the school. While leaving the house, my parents invited me and they told me, don't speak at school about what we live at home. So we were obliged to live in a parallel world, to show, but to live differently at home. And this split of each of us was very painful, because we had to hide. This is not only a history that we can observe this kind of situation. We can see it also in open societies of today, that each time when state or power or political party or a company refuses to individuals to be themselves, create conditions of oppression and of split between public and private. People cannot create, people cannot take action, people cannot take initiative, people cannot perform, cannot be active, cannot become actors, cannot stand by for things that they see as important. By doing so, the regime or the system diminishes their ability or their potential and scales down or obstructs the potential of each of us to be an actor of our own life. If we scale down the potential of citizens to act, only too late we recognize that no big things can be done by dwarfs. That no important actions can be realized by miniatures of people who are depossessed of their freedom, depossessed of their creativity, and depossessed of their freedom also to make errors. We observe it in education, in families. We can observe it in our communities, in our cities. But we can observe it also on the level of the whole nation. So, where comes this inspiration for Havel to act accordingly? And what can be done in today's society that we reinforce the resilience of each of us and we preserve the potential to be creative and to be actor? First, the inspiration for Havel comes most probably from Jan Hus, who was a very important spiritual leader of 15th century in our country, who invited, inspired by the Evangel, his communities to follow the life and the living in truth and to challenge the official authority. But we can also speak about Thomas Garrick Masaryk, who was the first president after 1918 of the former Czechoslovakia, and who also spoke about life according to the truth. And we could speak also about a philosopher, Jan Patočka. Jan Patočka is an amazing personality. He was philosopher, but the totalitarian system didn't want him to be teacher. So he was obliged to live in parallel polis, giving lectures at home. And he was one of the first spokesperson of Charter 77, the official call under the normalization time in 70s that challenged the government and the Communist Party, saying, hey, you are not living in truth. Because Patočka was portavoce, he was spokesperson of Charter 77, he was the first to be punished. He was already aged. He was a man of 70s and he was very sick. And in one of the interrogatories, the police, the official state administration under the communist rule made an official record of the interrogatory with mistakes. You see how the police in charge was trying to typewriter, finding the letters to explain what is the explanation of Patočka to engage. And here comes the mission or the reaction of Patočka. Old man, philosopher, oppressed by the regime, who could say, hey, leave me alone. And the policeman asks him during the interrogatory, Professor, he was not professor, Mr. Patočka, why do you do this? Why do you act in favor of Charter 77? Why do you protest? Do you need this with your age and with your health? And Patočka replies. And the police officer types. Patočka says, if me not, who else? If I don't engage myself, who else? This is the message. That even in the very difficult situation, in terms of political life, of social life, of health condition, of private condition, Patočka says, no, who else? I have to do so for the future of my country. Several days after, Patočka dies. he dies because he was, during the interrogatories, so forceless that he dies 2 weeks afterwards. So what can be done today to modify our society, to modify our structures, and to challenge the power when it is needed? What can we do to organize public affairs? Maybe with Patočka we can say, who else? Maybe I am in a situation that I can dare to act. We can create room for initiatives. We can create space for engagement. We can work in order to inspire pluralism and to give each of us the experience that we have a power. Yes, indeed, each of us has right to act, and one word of truth can change the world. And we can, by doing so, rebuild the social fabric. Yesterday I visited the exhibition, and I was amazed. Not by the texts, not by the photographies. I know about a lot of the authors of the photographies personally. I was amazed by you. So many people visiting, always accompanied by a young guide. I exchanged with the guides, and I realized how deeply they were inspired by Pavel. This transmission of the ideal that we can change the world was for me the experience of Rimini. Pavel himself would be amazed. Pavel himself would be amazed. He was a very curious person. He would just try to see what happens in the hall. If people are interested, they are. Mr. President, they are. He was able to listen to people debating important issue during 2 or 3 hours. And at the end, he took the floor and he made an analysis or synthesis of 1, 2, 3 minutes. So this capacity of listening, this curiosity, and for sure, he was a man of absurd theater, and he had a lot of sense of humor and of understatement. I think that Pavel can inspire us even today. If we feel powerless, still we can act. Thank you for inviting me today at Rimini. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. I would have now 1,000 questions for both of them, but I'll just ask one each. To Father Occhetta, often he said, well, we believers, well, at one point he said Pavel was not a Catholic person, but what impressed me a lot was his relation to Catholicism and the church and the sort of human honesty with which he was able to say some things. And we could ask ourselves why he did not convert, why doesn't he mention God? I mean, he sounds like a Christian, and he said, no, I'm not a Christian, because conversion is a change. When a person recognizes that Christ is the Son of God, and he said, well, I haven't gone through that. So he was extremely honest, and it's important to acknowledge that. But still, he had such a deep friendship relation to many Catholics. He knew Virginia, these great theologists, Dudka, the current Prague cardinal, and then not in prison, but you get to know Cardinal Tomaszek, the column of the Salone Church. Patočka was a Catholic, Aslav Benda, who gave him the idea of the parallel polis, was Catholic. So, and he asked for a book by Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianism, to his wife while he was in prison. So, also, Havel seems to have come across a sort of generous and mild church, and these are Virginia's words, and it was a key figure to him. And during the final event, in front of 500,000 people, he gave him the floor. He defined him, our Solzhenitsyn, and Virginia has become very dear to many of us because of a letter he wrote in 1970. He was a very sophisticated, refined theologist, obliged to humble jobs, and he was a soul, let's say, shepherd at night. And he wrote a letter to the Christians of the Western world, and there's a whole history behind that. We still have the original copy in the exhibition of this letter. And in this letter, he says, you're so good, you're very smart and clever, great intellectuals. You're good. You're a real example to us Christians who go through so much pain in the East. But, I mean, you have conformed to the mindset of this world. Well, you're somehow conforming is quite typical because you always arrive a little bit late, just a second late. You should read again Sanpaolo when he says, do not conform to this century mindset. And he says, this is the principle of a new life, of a new mindset. So this is the beginning of a new culture and therefore of a new kind of politics. So this is exactly about the parallel polis that reminds us of the city of God. It's another life, another culture. So my question for you, Father Occhetta, is the following. Considering that somehow you are directly involved in that, I mean, in these topics, what do you think about the church he got to know and his relation to the church? Well, first of all, I would like to express what Havel was to me when I reread these words. It was a provocation for my face when he met Pope John Paul II, and you didn't mention that as a president. Oh yeah, I wanted to say at the very end, actually. So Pope John Paul II tells him, do you know what a miracle is about? Well, what was the miracle he was talking about? His life, Havel's life, and the roots of his being a dissident. All that stemmed from the consistency of the dialogue he had with his consciousness. So to me, Havel is a strong, strong comeback to moral, ethical life when it comes to listening to the voices that are deep down us, inside us, that tell us how to live consistently. So being dissident leads to good, and lie leads to evil, lets you stay in what is evil. But then, in our life of faith, when you come across people like him that say they are not believers, well, that makes us somehow reconsider our relation between faith and justice, considering the evangel. Because if we sort of make the faith too extreme and we deny the second aspect, so our life become just a cult, but a worship. But if we only concentrate on justice, so little practice of the faith, well, no real authentic prayer experience, then our life just turns into something extremely ideological. Instead, the real challenge is to keep these two lungs alive equally, because this is about the intentions of our deeds and action. We need a lot of hope to live and be able to live. But the word gives us that, not my word, because I cannot be the source of words. I have to, choose the words I want to be inhabited from. And so each one becomes the word they hear. Even lay words, well, if they are mature words, they become God's words. So consciousness is an inner dialogue, but you also need to experience things. So we need to bring our young people back to experiences and try to live experiences in relation to one's own consciousness. And this is about something practical. This is something that has to do with emotions and the sort of affection side. So it's about really somehow lighten up a fire. And this is what we call faith. So to me, all this is Havel. Well, what you said about consciousness is extremely interesting because, well, I don't want to unveil what is in the exhibition, but the concept of consciousness of Havel was very different from the traditional modern concept of consciousness. So consciousness is not about your inner self-dialogue, the dialogue with yourself. No, he used to say consciousness is the thing that makes you take a decision and do something when you're alone, but you feel like you were observed by somebody else. So to him, actually, consciousness is the relation to the other. So he has so much to teach us. I want to read you a sentence, Pavel, because what you said about Patočka impressed me so much, because this is exactly what persuaded Havel, according to what I understood, to accept to be president of the Republic. Because Havel said, well, I've been a dissident and I was forced to become a dissident. I want to be a theater man, a playwright. So the only real change in my life was when I had to accept to enter the political arena and become a politician and accept an institutional role. I did not want to do it if that was something I did not want to swallow. But then I think that he remembered Patočka and this anecdote that you told, that he used to say that the real sort of test of a man is not how he's going to perform a certain role, but how he's going to perform the role given to him by destiny. So what was responsibility for Havel? Well, he insists a lot on this. So he talks about men and their responsibilities. And secondly, what is hope to him? Because he says, hope is not optimism. Optimism is something different from hope. Please.
Thank you very much. I am very touched that I can speak about man who was my boss and who inspired so many. When yesterday I spoke with young guides, they told me what part of Havel's thinking was of inspiration to them. First of them told me about his view on economics, because only economics, growth of the growth, as Havel noted to say, cannot save our societies. Second young guide from Rimini told me responsibility. Third young guy told me about hope. The fourth one spoke about Havel and Europe. And I was amazed how this inspiration that I lived in can be transmitted to them. Now, to your questions. First, responsibility. Response is some kind of reaction, is kind of a reply to an invitation, to a situation, to a condition that we are put in, and that we have to stay, pray, and understand what is the capacity to act that we have at hand. So for Havel, responsibility is a reply, is a reaction to someone, something that comes to us. And for Havel, responsibility was not only reaction to the public demand, to the demand of his friends, but also to the demand that comes from above, that there is even a metaphysical ground of responsibility. And with this metaphysical essere, being, he continues to have a dialogue. So for Havel, it is not an absence of being. No, this is very vividly relation. And responsibility for him is based also on this dialogue with the being. And second, the hope. For him, the hope is not only an optimistic view of the world, but that goes beyond. Regardless the success at the end, regardless the conditions that we are in, the only thing that if what we do makes sense to us, and that this sense opens us to the future, this is the hope for Havel. So this is not a guarantee that things will go well. This is not the guarantee that we will be happy. But this is only the certitude, certainty, conviction that things make sense. And he thinks like this when he was prisoner. He was thinking like this when he was dissident. And he tried to become in continuity with this thinking when he was in political role. Hope is not the same as optimism, but this is conviction that things that we do, our action, make sense. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much indeed. Many thanks to our two guests. I would like simply to go back to a sentence he said, because it tells us the task to fulfill. It's about reconstructing a human subject. Havel used to say, we need to restart from the self, from myself. And when I start anything all over again, well, I discover that I'm not the only one and that I'm not alone. There are so many others that I can join. So we need to reconstruct a human and social subject because, as Pavel said, dwarfs and miniature beings cannot do great undertakings.
Due avvisi.
Two quick announcements. First of all, please visit the exhibition. Secondly, this is extremely important. This is what allows the meetings and encounters with such high-profile guests, is that the meeting has been relying over the last 40 years on voluntary workers, on donation gratuitousness. So you will find the special stations with the Dona Ora, donate now. And so please donate in order to make this experience continue. Thank you.